I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Institute for Asian Studies. My name is Sharon Karstens, and I am the director of the PSU Institute for Asian Studies, and we are co-sponsoring today's event. It's so wonderful to see all of you, I, as I'm sure you all, are really looking forward to the lecture. I just wanted to mention that the Institute for Asian Studies here has regular lectures and other kinds of events. We have a website, and those things are announced there just to maybe pique your interest in some upcoming things. On April 12th, we have a group that is coming from Laos and talking about the legacies of war, clearing bombs, and protecting lives. That should be pretty interesting. On April 23rd, Mr. Pete Nickerson is going to talk about his experiences in doing business in China. His talk is going to be titled Venturing to China, One Oregonian Story, and I'll just say he's been very, very successful at what he does, so we're looking forward to that. On May 9th, Dr. Hyung-il Bai is going to talk about tourist images of Korea, the historical origins and their contemporary legacies. And she has written a prize-winning book on this topic, and we're definitely looking forward to that lecture. And then finally, on May 29th, Dr. Sherman Cochran will give a book talk on his new book called The Lius of Shanghai, A Chinese Family in Business, War, and Revolution. So lots of exciting stuff. And there's also other activities sponsored by the Center for Japanese Studies and the Confucius Institute. So there's lots going on here at Portland State, and we invite you all to come and to come often. And with that, I'd like to introduce Paul Milius, who is chair of the board of the Northwest China Council. He's going to introduce today's lecture, and he's going to introduce today's speaker. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Just for the record, I'm a member of the board, but not chair. Thank you. Thank you for the elevation. Good afternoon. It's with great pleasure that on behalf of the Northwest China Council that I welcome you all to today's lecture. It is the first in our series, which we're calling the Marcia Weinstein Memorial Lecture Series. Marcia was a longtime member of the China Council, a member of the board, and even through her long illness, she was a religious attender of China Council events. Her sister Molly is with us today. Welcome, Molly. My first thanks goes to Marcia and her bequest, which makes it possible for the China Council to expand our programs in this way. We'd also like to thank the Mark Spencer Hotel. It has donated our rooms for June last night, and also for the Institute of Asian Studies here at PSU for providing us the venue. To say that June and I are old friends, you know, when you get to be this age, you can talk about something that happened 50 years ago and actually have something to talk about, you know? And June and I first met when we were both first-year language students at the Institute of Far Eastern Languages at Yale University. She, as a just graduated on her way to master's degree at Harvard, civilian student taking her first Chinese course, and me as in my Uncle Sam's suit as a GI, learning to be, in the long run, a not very successful spy, but I did go off to defend the far-flung shores of freedom against the hordes. Anyway, since then, June, building on her BS from Wellesley in political science, has a master's in East Asian Studies from Harvard and a Ph.D. in Government and Far Eastern Languages from Harvard as well. Since then, she has taught at the University of British Columbia, at Miami University of Ohio. She has been the Chief Asian Specialist at the Library of Congress. She is now, and for many years has been, a fully tenured professor at the University of Miami in Florida, and along the way has served as a congressionally appointed commissioner to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. She has been an Asia advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations. She's been a guest lecturer at all three military academies, let me turn over here. More recently has been a keynote speaker for the annual conference of the National Security Agency, and the lecture today is based in some part on that presentation. Just to catch up on, June and I have had a chance over the last, she came in yesterday, and we've had a chance to catch up personally. It's nice to find that she is still direct, irreverent, and wryly humorous, and very erudite. I'm looking forward to hearing this speech. Thank you very much for coming. I give you Dr. June Teufel Dreyer of the University of Miami.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to live up to. And I really appreciate the Northwest China Council inviting me, and the generous request of your sister, Marcia Weinstein, and the hotel was really lovely. You know, every so often I stay at a hotel and you think, I could really just stay here. And it's, gosh, I mean, it's coffee and, you know, linen gets changed and it's a nice room and nobody has to do anything. You know, there's no lawn to row and things like that. So, you know, disconcertingly, everything in China moves so quickly that, as Paul mentioned, there's a couple of things in common with the talk I gave to the National Security Agency in June. But things have changed so much that it couldn't really be too closely related to it. But in any case, let me start off. This is the title I was given, China's Global Influence, Political, Military, and Economic, and that is a pretty large topic. And so without further ado, here we see a map of China, and obviously, as you already know, it's a very large country. What doesn't really appear on this map is the tremendous diversity within China. The Beijing government would love you to think that China has always been a unified state. It has not been. There is just recently, within the last century, the warlord period, where different warlords were running their own fiefdoms. There's a period in the past called the Three Kingdoms, and so on. And these regions are really very different in many ways. They have their own language, and the reason we don't call it separate languages is because they all use pretty much the same characters, but often they're mutually unintelligible. Their cooking styles are very different. Those of you who are habitués of Chinese restaurants know that Sichuanese food is very peppery, and Cantonese tend to like things deep fried, and people in North China like steamed buns and things like that. And the styles of opera are very different. So the Chinese government in Beijing is very vigilant against these centrifugal forces. And this is something that engages their attention. It's not all a foreign policy thing. There's a lot of internal challenges as well in such a large place. Okay, the current situation, this is not going to surprise anybody. The economic growth rates in China have been really amazing. Double-digit growth to average 10% since 1979. A couple of little dips there, but basically all good news on the upward trend. Military budgets have grown even faster than the GDP. And the growth in economic power and political power has given China's leaders enormous political influence, which they are using to advance China's interests as they see China's best interests, which is not necessarily the way everybody else sees them. But I tried to make a little list a couple of weeks ago about how I think Chinese leaders do see China's best interests. And one of them is they were really good, the Chinese leadership, at playing the United States off against the Soviet Union. And that ability diminished significantly after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So they are left with the idea that there is a unipolar world. And they're not exactly happy with that pole. the United States becomes very pushy in terms of human rights, and then the disintegrated Soviet Union was in need of help from the United States, so this diminished the ability of Russia to be played off against the United States, at least initially. And then a third blow was the first Gulf War, the one in 1991. And it seemed like the only pole was going to be very aggressive. In other words, the Chinese have something called the Panchashila, that's actually Hindi, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And one of them is that you don't interfere in the domestic affairs of another country. Now, the United States was arguing, but look, Iraq started this, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Isn't that invading the domestic affairs of another country? And so why do you object to NATO or the UN going in and getting Kuwait away from the clutches of Saddam Hussein? And the Chinese government replies, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Now, clearly, what's going on in their minds is if the United States is invading the sovereignty of Iraq today, the United States could be invading the sovereignty of China tomorrow, let's say about Tibet, for example, and it makes them nervous. Okay, so discomfort with the global unipolar power, concern that the United States means to force other countries to accept its views on democracy and human rights, feeling that they may be okay for the United States, even though they're not sure, but they are definitely not appropriate for China. Third, a desire to ensure a steady source of raw materials for China's expanding economy, and we'll talk more about that in a bit, and the perception that the United States is in decline, but it is still dangerous. So, yes, according to their view, the United States is declining, but it's not a time for complacency. You can't just wait until it has declined. It may be a problem in the interim. Interestingly, former Prime Minister of Singapore a couple of months ago went to China, and former Prime Ministers of Singapore and actually sitting Prime Ministers of Singapore have a tendency to be very blunt. Professor Carstens, who studies Malaysia, is already familiar with that. She's nodding. And this one said, in Beijing, make no mistake, the United States is not declining. It's going to be back. So, don't let yourselves get too complacent about this. All right. So finally and lastly, the fear of being surrounded. Now, this is a perception kind of thing because other countries see China expanding, and they worry. At the same time, China is worrying about being surrounded. Okay, so it's a mutually insecure situation there. Now, meanwhile, because the Chinese economy has been growing so quickly, they need resources. China actually is a country that has very comfortable endowment of resources. And in that sense, it's a very different country than, say, Japan, which doesn't, Taiwan, which doesn't, that sort of thing. But there are an awful lot of Chinese. 1.34 billion is the official figure these days. And the faster the economy grows, the more natural resources they need. And so they need to go elsewhere for them. And this has made them, China, an active player in normally, first of all, its backyard, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and more recently in Africa and Latin America and Russia and Central Asia and in North America. There is in the world a finite source of raw materials. No new petroleum is being manufactured. And at the same time, not only China, but other countries are trying to grow rapidly. Brazil, the former states of the Soviet Union, Poland, for example, Polish economy growing rapidly. India, another huge country, expected to have more people than China in a couple of years, and again on the move economically. So these principal competition has taken place for iron and non-ferrous metals, timber, and energy sources. And oil has caused the most controversy. China was actually self-sufficient in oil until 1993. It was the 7th largest importer of oil by 2000. That is a huge jump. 4th in 2010, and now it's second only to the United States. It may soon be first. The United States is hoping to be self-sufficient in oil, which would certainly solve part of the problem. But again, there are constraints on that. A lot of them would come from oil sands and fracking, and there are concerns about a serious threat to the environment if that happens. Okay, now, this is projections, and like all projections, they are subject to Murphy's Law. I mean, things that you don't expect happen. Clausewitz called this friction. You cannot predict. Oh, even better, my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra. Prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. But anyhow, this is what the gurus are saying these days. And you see how the Chinese supply of oil, that's the purple at the bottom, remains finite. It's not showing up too well. But the steep curve right above it should show up in blue. And this is the Chinese demand. And you see it going up. And then import is a percentage of demand. And pretty soon those two curves may meet, which can cause problems. So now let's look at China's estimate of China's energy use. This is from Chinese statistics. And you see here that an awful lot of this in 2008 comes from oil. And from coal. And they're hoping to reduce, but they're not counting on reducing it very much. The percentage from coal, China's got a lot of coal. Unfortunately, it's low-grade coal, which burns dirty. And there are ways of cleaning it, but they're expensive. And a lot of places don't, Beijing can say, be careful, conserve, make it clean. And people will say, let somebody else do it. We will save money by not doing that. And let's see, the next one, natural gas. And you see they do plan to expand that. Oil reduced slightly. Nuclear, 1% now, expected to be 5%. There are a lot of nuclear plants building. And it is interesting that the Chinese government was not deterred by the March 11th, 2011 disaster in Japan. And they say, we're going to do it better, and ours are going to be safer, and maybe they will, and maybe they won't. One person always thinks they can do it better than somebody else, and sometimes they can, but you can't count on it. And a nuclear plant disaster in Japan, it was awful. It could be even worse in China. So that's a concern. Hydropower. Yeah, maybe I just ought to do that, just because this is so hard to read otherwise. The hydroelectric, I was just thinking about this today. Paul was kind enough to take me on a tour, and we went to the Bonneville Dam, and they've been having a lot of problems with the hydropower in China because of, there are a whole bunch of problems. I could give 2 lectures on that, by which time you would all be asleep. But basically, The dam construction has been a problem. People in China don't like it either, and they have been demonstrating against it. The hydropower has also fallen afoot of various ecological problems. Among other things, the turbines chew up the fish, and the people who live on those fish get very, very upset. And a lot of inappropriate projects have been put in because local governments can be very powerful in China. I mean, not in the sense of challenging the central government directly, but the Chinese have a saying, heaven is high and the emperor is far away, meaning if Beijing doesn't find out what you're doing, too bad. There's another saying about the central government, you have a policy, I have a counter policy. So local governments have been able to, with the help of the collusion of local developers with money or outside developers with money, to put in projects that are really inappropriate. So it is interesting to see that they're not planning to expand this hydropower. In fact, see, it's 6% now, and they're actually planning to reduce it. So the other 2%, wind and solar, they are working on. And now, meanwhile, they want to exploit every possible source they can. This is the infamous, sometimes it's called the cow's tongue, and sometimes the 9-dotted line, but this is essentially China's claims in the East China and South China Sea, and you can see it comprises a very large area, close to Vietnam, close to the Philippines, close to the Japanese home islands, and so forth. And lots of other countries claim these as well. I believe there are 9 nations counting China. Not only China claims all of these areas. So the Philippines claims some of it, Taiwan claims some of it, Japan claims some of it, but in other words, it's China that has the dispute with the other 8. Okay. And Deng Xiaoping is reputed to have said a long time ago that what China should do is hide its capabilities and bide its time. Now, he never said China should do this forever, and it seems like within China now there are competing ideas about has the time come to stop hiding their capabilities and stop biding their time and claim what they feel is theirs, and others say, not so fast. We would be even stronger 10 years from now, and you are maybe scaring into existence a countervailing international coalition before China's capable of dealing with it. As of now, I would say the Stop Biding Our Time coalition seems to be ahead, and here you see Sansha. This was founded actually right after I gave that talk at the National Security Agency in 2012. Sansha, the Chinese were names for the Spratlys, the Paracels, and Macclesfield Reef. In the Chinese names all end in sha, meaning sand or sandbank. And so Sansha is 3 sands, 3 sandbanks. So this is founded on this godforsaken island with no indigenous source of water except what can be collected in barrels. And it is founded to bolster China's claim to these 3 groups of islands. The last one isn't really an island, it's a reef, but for the sake of argument here. So and they built a huge airstrip. Now imagine the engineering involved in that. I was swept away today by the engineering in the Bonneville Dam, but there's a source of water, drinkable water, when you're building the Bonneville Dam. No water there. It all has to be shipped in over sea in a very treacherous area. It's a 14 to 16-hour journey through treacherous seas with all these low coral reef thingies coming out of the water to rip the bottom out of your boat. And they're going to garrison this and with maritime forces as well as air force to protect the claims to those islands. This is Schwimmen Air Base. I am quite amused by this. Those of you who know Chinese, Schwimmen means Watergate. And it's just an accident, but anyway. This is a picture I managed to procure through sources I can't tell you about, of how this strip is. It's now on Google, and how the airstrip is being constructed. And this one is from a Chinese language source, as you see, and this shows the distance from Schwimmen to these major areas that are claimed both from Japan and from Taiwan and downward toward the south. Scarborough Shoal, known to the Chinese as Huangyan Island, became the focus of a dispute this spring and summer 2012. You look at it and you say, why are people fighting about this hunk of rock? And here you see, this is actually from I believe a Korean cartoonist, and it's kind of cute because there's the Filipino and with his flag and the Chinese with his flag fighting, and meanwhile all of these cartons of stuff are disappearing in the sea, but it is rich in oil and gas and fish. This is also very important. As you probably know, the world's fish stocks are diminishing in many cases. And in the case of particularly a lot of Asians, this is their major source of protein. And fish are important. And in some countries, I don't think unions are too important in China yet, but in Japan, for example, the fishermen's union is extremely powerful, and this is the way they make their living. It's the way their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents made their living, and they don't want to do something else. And so this is a point of contention. And another point of contention is it's also easy for a country to use its fishermen as, to mix the metaphor, stalking horses for something else. So there's oil and gas there, but you can use the fishermen as the excuse. Okay, so this is the Diaoyu Senkaku dispute. I am being very, very careful about this to be neutral. This is alphabetically arranged, okay? D, Diaoyu, Chinese claim. S, Senkaku, the Japanese claim. All right, and that's only one of several disputes the Chinese and the Japanese have. And there you see the boundary. Now, this is another one, which is a fun dispute. China does not claim this island. They just claim it isn't an island. Now, again, I am being very, very careful here because the Japanese call this Okinotori Shima, and Shima means island. Now, what the Japanese are doing, I should say here, see this little, I have a pointer here. Yeah, that's the island, according to the Japanese. It is supposed to be there are two of those, only one of them shows up there, and they are each said to be approximately the size of a queen-size bed. Okay? Now, the islands were discovered by the British in the 18th century. British did not claim them, they just named them. And then they sailed away again, never to come back. So when the Japanese found them, they said, okay, we're going to call this distant bird, Okinotori, and Shima. The problem is that this is an area of the South Pacific where winds blow and erosion takes place. It's coral reef, okay? And so it got smaller and smaller and smaller. And what you are seeing here is approximately 20 years ago, the Japanese government arrived with tons and tons and tons of cement. And they surrounded the futon-sized beds with something like 40,000 tons of concrete or cement. I'm sorry, I have both of them in my garage and I can't keep them straight. But anyhow, and they then drilled holes in them so water can come out because it has some significance in international law. Now, why are they doing this? Because it amounts to, you can claim a larger exclusive economic zone if that's an island. You cannot claim it if it's a hunk of rock, okay? Again, this is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and which says that it has to be a rock capable of supporting life. Now, as you can see here, there's life out there. See, life? Little people running around up there? Yes, life, okay. But what about a rock? And because the law of the sea says if it can't sustain life, then it's not an island, it's a rock. And the Japanese say this doesn't apply because it's coral reef, it's not rock. And they're right. If you look up the definition of rock, it isn't. But do you really want Japan, on the basis of this, to be able to claim, and it's actually an EEZ 3 times the size of the Japanese home islands. So that's another one of the disputes. And yes, it does sound like kids in a sandbox, but a lot of international relations actually is like kids in a sandbox. All right, now, a large part of China's economic clout is because it is able to trade with countries on favorable terms. And the positive aspects of this is that these countries get a counterweight against former colonial powers and the United States. So you find a number of Latin American countries eager to trade with China because it isn't the United States and it isn't Spain and it isn't Portugal. I don't know, I didn't know anything about Latin America before I moved to Miami, and you learn fast. And one of the things you learn is that Spain, for example, the Spanish oil company has a huge stake in Latin American oil. And not everybody in Latin America is crazy about that. So the Chinese come and say, let us help, and you think, wow, take that, Spain, kind of thing. And so that's good. And these Latin American countries, this is again something I would not have known before I got to Miami, they raise a lot of soybeans. Tofu is very popular in China, as is shoyu, soy sauce to put on stuff. And so they buy a lot of soy products. And another advantage is the Chinese, and I put in parentheses, say they don't interfere in local politics. This is horse feathers. But people believe what they want to believe. So if there's a nasty dictator in Africa, and there are several nasty dictators in Africa, and the Chinese government comes in and says, what do you need? And the Chinese dictator says, I need missile protection for my summer home. I am not kidding. This actually Girl Scouts sign here, it actually happened. They gave Mugabe rockets to protect his summer home. Anybody think of any external country that wants to take away Mr. Mugabe's summer home? No, it's his domestic opposition. So they are interfering in local politics. And I could give you more examples of that, but anyway. The negative aspects, keeping corrupt governments in power, such as Mr. Mugabe's government, and not living up to the terms of contracts, that has happened, abusive treatments of workers, and I think there is actually not much evidence that the Chinese companies treat foreign workers any worse than they treat their own workers, but that's not going to go. And if you're oppressed by one of your own, that's bad. But if you're oppressed by somebody from outside, it seems worse, right? Okay, and there are a lot of complaints about that. Another bunch of complaints, and this happens in several Latin American countries and a number of African countries. The Chinese bring in immigrants, in other words, other Chinese from China, who get the most desirable jobs, and local unemployment remains high. Now, sometimes people in Africa have been astonishingly candid about this. And I talked to one Algerian worker who said, you know, in Algeria, we just don't have people with the skills these Chinese workers have. And this is our fault. But more often than not, you don't hear that. And another one I found was very funny is in a sub-Saharan African country. And he was saying, you know, we didn't like the British, but we really wish we had them back because they take a lot of tea breaks. And the problem with these Chinese is they just work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they want us to work like that too. So you see what I mean. And these Chinese workers feel that they don't have life very easy, and they have their own complaints, but again, it's the indigenous countries making the complaints that causes the problem. To the extent that a couple of years ago, when the then Chinese President Hu Jintao went to Zambia, not Mugabe's, but he could not go to Copperbelt province because the government said they couldn't guarantee his safety. The workers were that upset. Okay. Promise projects sometimes don't materialize. This has happened. Chinese development projects are ruining the environment. Again, they're ruining the environment in China too in a lot of cases. But when it's someone from outside who does it, it seems worse. Again, you know, it takes two to tango. Somebody has to agree to the Chinese doing this project. And there are a lot of nasty stories, none of which I can prove, but you know, it's just sometimes if people believe it, then that's what's important, that the Chinese companies are bribing politicians in the African government to agree to projects that have the end result of despoiling the environment. Now, is that totally China's fault? No, but it happens. And if it happens to be your farm whose environment is wrecked, it's more convenient to blame the Chinese than not. All right, the local products can't compete with Chinese-made items, forcing native producers out of business. Again, if you're an economist, not for nothing do they call this the dismal science, you're going to say, okay, efficiency makes the world go around, and if the Chinese can produce this at lower prices, this is the iron law of economic development. Don't worry about it, find other jobs. If you're one of the displaced workers, this can be a problem for you. And one of these is, it's a cloth that we mostly in the United States refer to as kente cloth, typical African designs. I am told by a genuine African student at our university that this should only refer to cloth made in Kenya. But I'm assuming that most of you are like me and you look at it and you say, this is very pretty cloth and it's African, so we'll call it kente. In other words, what happened is the Chinese came in and they said, pretty cloth, nice designs. And they bought some and they took it back to China and they computer copied it, and they can now sell it at 1/3 of the price back in Africa. And you see this, it's our tradition, it rubs the wrong way. This is not the only place that has happened. In Mexico, I am told that you cannot buy a Mexican flag that was made in Mexico. They are all made in China. And something that particularly bothers people, the patron saint of Mexico is the Virgin of Guadalupe. You cannot buy a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe that was made in Mexico. They are all made in China. So, okay, it rankles, and maybe it shouldn't, but it does. Indigenous industrialization is discouraged from ever taking place. In Africa, for example, you didn't have indigenous industrialization to any extent. And now there's no reason to do it because you can export your raw materials at high prices to China. And in Latin America, what Latin America wanted to do is free itself from domination by the colossus of the North, namely the United States, and this idea of dependencia economics, that the capitalist country will come in and buy raw materials cheaply, take them back to the mother country, have them made into something manufactured, sell it back at a much higher value-added price. And so they were liberating themselves from this. Brazil has an automobile industry. Brazil has a very good shoe industry, not cheap, good shoes. What are some of the others? Well, that's the chief, is the automobile, and Latin American planes, Embraer, that sort of thing. And the Chinese then come in and buy lots and lots of raw materials, and this is called the Dutch disease. There's no reason to industrialize, or actually in this case you're deindustrializing, because the profits from the raw materials are so comfortable, okay? Industrialization takes a lot of work. Selling soybeans does not. So there's concern that the industrialization process is going the other way. Now, here is a cartoon I found in an African website, African comment on the Chinese presence, and you can see that they pretty well like it. At least this cartoonist does. And it sees some sad sack from the developed world coming with a book called Human Rights. And here, there's this starving, weary African, and he's being fed by a very happy Chinese. So that's the upside of it. Now, China is not totally comfortable being energy dependent on imports. They worry about what could happen. And one of the things they're doing is developing their Navy. And I love to talk about the Navy, but I won't have time to. So let's talk about what they're doing to develop their indigenous energy, reduce their exogenous energy dependency. Nuclear power, solar power, hydroelectric, water diversion projects, biomass conversion, and smart buildings. Here is a solar power facility in Gansu in the northwest. You can see there it's a huge scale. Here is a hydropower facility in Sichuan. Looks a little bit like Bonneville Dam that we saw today. And as I mentioned, the dam construction has caused a lot of other problems. There is also, and I should have mentioned this earlier, a huge problem of corruption, which is getting a lot of people very, very angry. And there is a temptation to save money to water down the cement. Yeah. And when you do this, or you construct a dam sloppily, you know, cheaper to leave out some of the rebars, a lot of water pressure. The higher the dam, the higher the water pressure, and I believe that increases geometrically rather than arithmetically. So these dams collapse, and they inundate the areas with water. There have also been mudslide problems because the soil is not, the area is just not geologically suited for the dam that's being built. Another problem they had, and this is in, this was happening in Qinghai, I guess you would call this the near northwest of China as opposed to the far northwest. They, in a Tibetan area, and you know, it's wonderful, and the National Geographic went out there and they took photographs of some monk in a yurt. By the way, nobody in these areas calls them yurts, they're gurs. And so there is the monk in his gur watching television. Whoop-de-doo, modernization comes to the area. Not so fast. The dam has a mitigating effect on the temperature. So the area around the dam is warmer. And meanwhile, you've got this continental climate subject to tornadoes in the first place. And the tornado is caused by warmer air, meaning cooler air. So there you are, it had a problem in the first place, and now you put this warmer air mass in, and you get more typhoons, and eventually this dam just collapsed, and which is probably a mercy, because before it collapsed, it was eroding the land because the winds increased, and the herders couldn't graze their animals on there anymore because the vegetation, which is always sparse, wasn't growing anymore. So there are all kinds of problems that really weren't thought through about this hydropower. Diverting water from south to north, this is an enormous headache because the south doesn't have all that much water to spare, even though the north is more needy. There's also a tremendous problem of exporting the pollution. You know, you dig a channel and it's got graves in it, and it's got garbage in it, and you're moving along with moving the water, you're moving the garbage. And in one case, just as the thing was about to be flooded, there was a biblical proportion exodus of rats out of the area into people's homes, of course, and they did not appreciate it. Okay, biomass power generation. This is supposed to be mostly from cotton stalks. The only picture I could find was recycled waste paper, but again, they are trying, and I tried to find photos from all over, and this one is from Shandong in the northeast of China. Even so, pollution is getting worse, and this photo was taken by a friend of mine in the early afternoon in Beijing in January of 2013. It was part of about 20 he sent me, and I thought this one was, you know, I like the sun above the building, so I chose this one. And this is not the only. Was another inversion last month. The income inequalities have worsened, and here you have some of the data. The NBS is the National Bureau of Statistics. The CHFS is the China Household Finance Survey. And then there are also surveys from CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Scientists. These guys are very smart and very well informed. And because they do not publish their findings in tabloid magazines, the government generally lets them say what they want. And for those of you not familiar with the Gini coefficient, it was invented by an Italian economist, Signor Gini, G-I-N-I. And I have to emphasize this to my students who keep wanting to spell it G-E-N-I-E. And the 0 is a perfect equality of income. 1 is perfect inequality of income. Now, obviously, if everybody there's never been a country where everybody's income was absolutely equal, not that I know of, and if there were a country with perfect inequality, that means one person would have all the money and everybody else would starve. And so a generally nice area to be in is somewhere in the 0.35 to 0.39 area. And as you can see, this is National Bureau of Statistics. Nobody really believes them. But the China Household Finance Survey is 0.61. This is right down there with the worst of the Latin American societies. Now, I suppose, this is not to say that people in Latin America like this, or you would not have had the Chiapas Rebellion in Mexico, or Sendero Luminoso in Peru, or Chavez in Venezuela, but somehow it's more, Latin Americans are more used to it. They don't like it, they're just more used to it. And they were not brought up in a school system that said, Mao Zedong said everybody should be equal. So it grates. And 0.4 is considered the danger zone. So if China is 0.61, this is scary. And furthermore, there are a lot of ways that to capture income that the Chinese statistics don't. For example, in the United States, if you have a second home or a car and a driver come with your home, the IRS finds out about it, and that's counted as income. I know we got tuition remission for my kids when they were in college, and the IRS found a way to tax that too. So this is not taxed in China. So, for example, if you get a house and a driver and, you know, a meal allowance, the income inequalities may be even worse than is said. And one Chinese economist said that what China has is Shanghai may be comparable to New York, but it's as if Shanghai is surrounded by an oasis that, it's not really an oasis, but is surrounded by a countryside that's like Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is the country that had over 1,000,000% inflation a couple of years ago. It's poor. Okay, now, we humans are a very, you know, on the one hand, a large number of Chinese citizens are having a much better life than they had 30, 40 years ago. Some of them are not, but a lot of them are. And we humans are like that, and we constantly ask our government, what have you done for us lately? And more Chinese are being dissatisfied that the government hasn't done more and more for them lately. And this gentleman is Ai Weiwei. He is the guy who designed the birdcage for the Olympics. And he is a very famous artist. And he is not afraid to, as you see here, literally give the finger to the leadership. And I was explaining to John Wang last night over dinner that I wish I could show you more of these because there is nothing more clever than a Chinese dissident cartoonist. The problem is that most of these are very obscene. Okay, let's see. Here is a clean one on Weibo, as the Chinese Twitter. And this is a satire on the anti-Japanese protests. The Chinese government has actually done quite a bit to whip up anti-Japanese sentiment in China because it's convenient. To the extent that people are mad at Japan and mad at the United States, they're less mad at the Politburo, the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So this is the recent riots. And what you see here is people are being given leaflets and being admonished by one of these, I guess are these chickens or geese?
Those are they're representative anthropomorphic
poultry.
Domestic fowl.
Okay. I'm from Brooklyn. We don't do agriculture there. But anyhow, there's some kind of poultry here representing the Chinese people. And you can see that they're carrying these anti-Japanese signs there, protect the Diaoyu, Senkaku. And notice this little guy here. That's a Japanese camera around him. He's taking pictures of this with his Japanese camera, and that shouldn't be. And I know also in this riot, and there's, you know, it's limited to how many pictures I thought you wanted to see, but there was a guy driving down the street in a Japanese car, and he had put a sticker on the back saying, "Japanese car with Chinese heart." So I love my Toyota, but I'm patriotic, and kind of thing. And then back here, and this is an important part of the cartoon, you see here there's feathers flying. This is the idea they're representing the secret area where the Politburo Standing Committee is meeting, and they're killing each other. You see the feathers flying there. So the geese are being whipped out, or I'm sorry, the poultry are being whipped out, up out here, and back there they're fighting over what's really going on. Now, this is another one that requires some explanation. What you see up here, this Tiananmen, this was Chairman Mao. This is where Chairman Mao's picture hangs normally. Right there. And this is every Chinese will recognize this as the beginning of a very famous Mao quotation that sailing the seas, the big sea, you have to rely on the helmsman. And Mao Zedong's, a word for Mao Zedong was the great helmsman. So there is where Mao's picture hangs and this familiar quotation. Now, last spring there were horrible, horrible floods in Beijing. And a lot of people live underground. These used to be bomb shelters. And they have now, because there's housing shortage, people live down there in these tunnels. And also people have, like we used to have in New York, their basement apartments. And in this great skyscraper building, craze, they didn't build sewers. So instead of the runoff happening, it just flooded people, and there really were cars up to their windows, not actually in Tiananmen Square, but in parts of Beijing, and people died, and we are not sure how many, but at least there's a definite count of 127, but it's probably higher. And so this is the reason that the cartoon is funny, because where Mao's picture is, this is a turtle, an egg. And the reason there are little flippers here is to show you this is not an ordinary egg, it's a turtle's egg. You know, turtle's egg in Chinese is an obscenity, because a turtle doesn't know who its daddy is. So you see, it's kind of, it's as if to say Mao Zedong is an SOB, okay? That's the gist of it. So again, very, very clever cartoons. And as I was saying to Paul before, the problem with this is, even though I can read Chinese okay, I'm not going to get the subtleties in this most of the time. I need a native speaker to explain them to me. Fortunately, I've got one. All right, future economic growth rate is in doubt. I have a good friend who's an economist, and he tells me that there is an economic theory, and he gave me the article, which I can't understand because it is all written in sigmas and, you know, lots of equations. But the gist of it, thank God I have an interpreter for that too, is that there is something called the tunnel theory in economics. The idea is that if you think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, in other words, if you have hope that if you continue to work really hard, your income will rise. In other words, there will be something good. My income is terrible now, but if I keep on working, it'll get better. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel. And that is the reason more Chinese are not out on the streets getting unhappy. See? Because they continue to hope that things are going to get better. Now, a long time ago, an American labor leader, it was so long ago, it was actually Jimmy Hoffa, and that's how long ago, and somebody said there's light at the end of the tunnel in this economy, and he said what you think is light at the end of the tunnel is actually a freight train coming at you from the opposite direction. And this is what the Standing Committee, this is one of the things that they are worried about. So this does not look good. Now, this is the fact that the economy is slowing, and I read in the New York Times today, Chris Buckley was saying the Chinese economy is wobbling. I think that's a lovely phrase, because it doesn't really say it's going down. It doesn't say it's going up. It's wobbling. So Chinese economy, there's a law of economic gravity. You can't just keep going up forever. And I actually remember when we thought the Japanese economy was going to take over the universe. If you just kept on extrapolating out, it didn't happen that way. In 1990, the bubble bursts, and it's never, refilled since then. So it isn't a bad idea to bring the Chinese economic growth rate down a bit. You just don't want it to happen precipitously. And could you achieve a soft landing? In other words, you don't want it to go down like that, because that's very disruptive. And the Alice in Wonderland dilemma is, how do you reduce the economy slowly and gently so that you don't get these major disruptions? That's not easy. And I noticed again in today's New York Times, there was a picture of the person who has just been named the premier of China, Li Keqiang, and he is looking, his expression on his face reminds me of somebody who has just been sentenced to death by hanging, you know. And I was saying to Paul, it's as if he has suddenly discovered the enormity of the job he has just been given. It's an honor, and boy, is it a responsibility. Okay, now, decreased foreign exchange deposits. you can see that more money seems to be being withdrawn and sent abroad. This is not quite legal, but people have figured out ways to do it. And one of the things my friends in finance tell me is when the locals start moving the money out, they know something. They probably know something you don't know. So this is not a good sign. Okay, here's the new leadership. Here's the president, Xi Jinping. And here is the new premier before he got his "I have just been sentenced to the gallows" expression. Possible spoilers. Bo Xilai, most of you have probably read about him. There was a major scandal, a couple of you are nodding. He was touted as one of the comers. He was really good, in a really good position to be put in the Politburo Standing Committee, this very, very tiny group of people who are in top positions in China. And he had a very interesting program, which was it, Sing Red, Hit Black. And the idea is he was having everybody sing these Revolutionary Era songs, which are indeed very catchy. I mean, they're fun tunes to sing. And Beat Black, he was dealing with these corrupt, I guess you would call them the Chinese mafia, the secret societies, and doing a lot of like social welfare projects, housing for poor people, and so on. And the rest of the Politburo didn't seem to like him. He was a show-off, and what's this saying? It's the nail that sticks out that gets hammered down. Yeah. That kind of thing. He was sticking out too far and that kind of thing. So he was a challenge from the left. And all of a sudden, the head of his police force, a man named Wang Lijun, appeared in the consulate in Chengdu in Sichuan province. Now, Chongqing is also in Sichuan province, but the American consulate is in Chengdu. And so the chief of police appears in Chengdu and apparently says, "I want asylum," and then stays there for a couple of days and then walks out the door. He did walk out the door. It is televised. There is a strong implication that he was pushed out the door because you can't give asylum for something like that, you know. And apparently he spilled the goods on Bo Xilai. And among other things, because the consulate isn't telling you what we know from other sources, but apparently what he did is say that Bo's wife murdered her British lover, and then Bo covered it up. So he's out. Spectacular trial, blah, blah, blah. But his ideas are not out. He has a number of supporters who think what he was doing is the right thing. They don't necessarily condemn murdering people and trying to cover it up, but they say, look, his ideas are important, and we think he got screwed. He may even be innocent. They wanted to get rid of his ideas. And so he's gone, but his ideas are not forgotten. This is Major General Luo Yuan, who is a real hawk, and who is reputed to have said that the Chinese should burn Tokyo, among other things, okay? Now, where do we end on this? And I can see I'm really close to the end of my time here. Conclusions. There are factional disputes within the Chinese leadership. We know this. The outgoing president, Hu Jintao, did not want Xi Jinping to succeed him as president. He wanted Li Keqiang instead. Hu Jintao and Li Keqiang come from the Communist Youth League faction. They support the idea of doing more for the hinterlands, more for the people who are disadvantaged in various areas. Xi Jinping comes from the faction of the party known as the Princelings. These are sons and daughters. Princelings is a gender-free connotation. These can be either female or male, but they are the offspring of the founding fathers and mothers of the Communist Party government in China. And the Xi Jinping came out on top, but that doesn't mean the factional dispute is gone. As people try to count the factional lineup in the new Politburo Standing Committee, there are more princelings than CYL people there, but there's going to be friction. Some of it is personality-based, because Bo Xilai was a princeling, but he got knocked out, and there's no evidence that either faction liked him very much. So that was personalistic, but there's also policy questions here as well. Here's what we think, and we're not sure we think we know, but nobody in the Chinese leadership wants another Mao Zedong. He does not have a good reputation because he, along with doing a lot of good things, he did some very, very bad things. So they want to avoid an all-powerful leader who might want to make big mistakes like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And by the way, if you want really grim reading, there is a book called Tombstone. And you've heard of it? No? This is a guy who went around, a Chinese fellow, who went around snooping in local archives for records of what happened in the Great Leap Forward. And it's sickening. Parents eating their kids, and other people who couldn't bear to eat their kids, so they traded their kids for other people's kids. Yeah, and people who ate clay just because there was absolutely nothing to eat. You know, they had eaten the rats and the bugs and stripped the trees of bark, and they die, and it's a very bad way to die because you eat clay and then you drink something and the clay hardens. Yeah, okay. It's too close to cocktail hour to go on with this. But, I mean, these were really, really bad mistakes, and so was the Cultural Revolution. So they don't want another Mao. The consensus is that China really, really needs economic reforms if it is going to be able to continue its trajectory moving forward. Not necessarily at double-digit rates, but let's say at a comfortable 7.58%. And they need to do this because the population continues to expand. The one-child policy, it worked to bring down the birth rate, but it did not result in everybody having one child. And even if it did, that would cause other problems because the workforce would have to diminish, and then you would have a smaller number of working age people supporting a larger population of elderly people who have more health needs, and China does not have a great health system to start with, etc. So tremendous problems ahead. How to deal with pollution. This is just a huge issue. And you know, when pollution hits Beijing in a big Beijing is not the most polluted city in China. That honor belongs to Lanzhou in the near northwest. But when something hits Beijing, you get an awful lot of very angry people and a number of very, very angry journalists, many of them foreign, and you just got to do something about that. So these are huge issues. They're now talking about relaxing the one-child policy. Okay, they're going to relax the one-child policy, and what happens then? You have more Chinese who need houses and jobs and create more waste matter. And, you know, it's kind of like an expression Americans like to use, kicking the can down the road, right? You postpone the problem. Release tension now, make it greater later. So the potentially volatile mix of social forces, growing social inequality, a deteriorating environment, and increasingly powerful military, such as General Luo Yuan, who wants to bomb Tokyo, and nationalism, which the government is encouraging because to the extent that people are patriotic Chinese, they may notice less the problems in society and think about the problems outside society. And a debate that the United States government is having is, would a weakened China be more harmful to United States interests or less harmful to United States interests? And I don't know the answer to that one. And so I'm closing on that note, and I thank you for being a lovely, attentive audience, and anybody with any questions, I would be glad to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, June, for a very interesting talk, and in the interest of getting the questions started, today's New York Times, which you've been quoting, they cited tension between the people of Hong Kong and the central government. What do you make of this in terms of the evolution of policy and economics in China?
Wow. Hong Kong, when it was retaken by the Beijing government, they put in a government there, that is, Beijing put in the government, which was run by a mega tycoon, no other word will do, very, very wealthy man. And he ran it on behalf of wanting to keep up the prosperity of Hong Kong. And there's a lot of feeling among the people of Hong Kong that the prosperity, which is there. I mean, anybody who's visited Hong Kong, this is amazing, skyscrapers and luxury and things like that, is going to the benefit of these tycoons, of whom there are quite a few. It's a very cozy set. They intermarry. Their kids go to Oxford and Cambridge and the Sorbonne and Yale and so on. And the common people are missing out. And Hong Kong has a very well-developed, well-educated, politically aware middle class. And they're saying, what about us? We want democracy. And in a way, it's challenging not just Beijing, but the tycoons. And so they are pushing for more democracy. And they demonstrate, and it's always very peaceful demonstrations. As they say, they're well-behaved middle-class people, and they know they don't want to step out of bounds. And so they cannot get what they're asking for through normal means, which is by saying, please expand democracy. And they cannot get what they want through demonstrations, because if there are demonstrations, Beijing will say, we just feel that you're not mature enough to have a democratic election here. And so there's a lot of frustration building up. Now, I don't know where it's going, but the people of Hong Kong are much better able to emigrate to other countries. And if they do that, that takes the pressure off the others, because if Hong Kong is short of labor, there is no shortage of people from China proper who are willing to move to Hong Kong to run those industries and would be very capable at it. So, but it doesn't look good for the future of democracy, the evolution of democracy in Hong Kong, put it that way. I don't think Hong Kong is going to rack and ruin. There's also a lot of concern in Hong Kong about pollution as well. And, we were talking about the tycoons essentially having made a deal with Beijing. We keep Hong Kong quiet, and you let us do what we do best, which is make money here in Hong Kong. And they signed something with the Beijing government called the CEPA, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. And this was a conduit to funnel Hong Kong's mega billions into the Pearl River Delta, where you have amazing factories. I visited many of them when I was with the commission. There is a factory which makes something like 90%, believe it or not, of the world's socks. And there are I know they're not good socks, by the way. On the inner side of the toe, there's a great big knot, and if you won't, if you just try it on in a store, it feels okay. But who tries on socks anyway? But if you get home and you're on a hiking trip or mowing the lawn, you're going to feel it very soon. In any case, you probably say, what the heck, 10 pairs of socks for $2, I can't really complain. But they also make cars, a lot of auto factories set up there belonging to Japanese companies, Korean companies, and so on. This massive development just wrecked the ecology of the Pearl River Delta. And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction about that. And I, as a member of the commission, this is an unusual situation, because when the last time I lived in Hong Kong, I was a student and walked a lot of places to save money rather than the 15 cents that the bus cost. This is poverty, okay? And there I was having lunch on the top floor of this enormous building belonging to one of these shipping tycoons in Hong Kong. And he said he wasn't worried about pollution. And it was really interesting because the top of the building was, Hong Kong buildings are very tall. The top of the building was so high that you could actually, it was above the clouds and the pollution in Hong Kong. And easy for somebody like that to say, I'm not worried about pollution. But most of the population doesn't live, and so they're worried. So it's not just what's going on in Hong Kong, it's what's going on in the entire Pearl River Delta. And there was a guy who was always opposed to Bo Xilai, because Bo Xilai had a kind of socialistic model. And the party secretary in Guangdong, which is the province near Hong Kong, had a more liberal agenda, Wang Yang, and he didn't make it into the Politburo either, much less the Central Committee. And I was just reading in that New York Times today that he has been named Deputy Prime Minister. The next question to ask, and I don't know what the answer is how much influence over policy he's going to have. Because he's definitely a progressive, and he would want to move toward more liberal, giving people more power to elect their representative, albeit on the very lowest level. Don't expect to hear people politicking to be a member of the Politburo in the near future, but at least a little bit more democratic reforms. But it doesn't seem to be happening. Yeah.
I have a question, maybe or two separate questions, but one is, to what extent does the Chinese work its policies through its corporate investments overseas, and to what extent are the mineral interests being kind of concentrated in the hands of Chinese around the world?
The mineral resources concentrated in of other countries.
Right.
Yeah, this is definitely happening. And if, for example, there's a capital iron and steel Shogun in capital Beijing, and they were investing abroad, and one of the things they invested in was a mine, iron mine in Peru, Shogun Fierro, Peru, and a lot of labor problems there. And then in Africa, they bought a copper mine, several copper mines, and there were labor problems there. Again, that's a problem. The country that they're in should be controlling this better. And they won't. Not in Africa and not in Latin America. And they should be the one to come in and say, look, we have an environmental impact here. And if you're not living up to it, you get fined, etc. They're not doing it. So you can blame some of this on the Chinese, but you can't, a lot of it is the fault of the government. Now, another country that is very eager to have the Chinese buy lots and lots is Canada, and particularly the province of Alberta. And there is a China Institute there, which never critical of China in any way, and Alberta's made a very resource-rich province, oil fields, etc. So they're very happy about it. And in Australia, this was interesting because when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister, people said, oh, he speaks fluent Mandarin. He's going to be so pro-China. And is that a stupid statement? I mean, is that a stupid statement? Anyway, so Kevin Rudd apparently does speak good Mandarin, but he got very upset because the Chinese were buying up too much of Australian mines and so on, and so he started putting restrictions in. Now the difference is the Australian government is reasonably well run. And so can you blame the Chinese for offering bribes to get what they want? You see what I mean? And can you blame the, I do blame the African governments for not forcing environmental protection, the same with Latin American governments. Yes?
This is coming from the terrible atrocity going on in China right now about organ harvesting from living beings. In the underground, there are like hundreds of underground facilities where innocent people, mostly Falun practitioners, are held like cattle. And when rich people come from abroad and local rich people means transplantation, they just cut it open. But the way military hospitals handle. So this has been going on for 15 years. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people are being murdered. So what do we tell them?
What can I say about it? I'm against it. It's awful. And as you say, many of these are Falun Gong practitioners. And they're not, it's not like they're convicted of murder.
Could you please repeat the question?
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. She has a very soft, lovely voice. And it wasn't carrying. These stories of organ harvesting. Sorry, the light's shining in my face here. Organ harvesting. And that is that people are being, if you need a kidney transplant or a liver transplant or a heart transplant or whatever, you get put on a list in this country. And there are more people needing transplants apparently than there are organs available. And in China, rich people will go there and an organ will be provided for them. And the Chinese say these are taken from executed prisoners who have given their consent. And the families of these people say they couldn't possibly have given their consent. And in any case, suppose they did. We will kill you slowly and excruciatingly painful if you don't consent, or we'll give you a bullet to the head if you do. It's not really a fair kind of informed consent sort of thing. And then, as the lady said, a number of these will be Falun Gong practitioners who by our standards have not committed any crime. They are jailed because they want to continue to practice their religion. It is not as if their religion, mandates killing babies or anything like that. So they're not doing anything strictly illegal. And the Falun Gong people have maintained that what is being done is they're pulling these organs out of living people. In other words, they are not waiting until people die. They're just, we want your kidney, lie down here, sort of thing. And again, you cannot prove these things. Nobody is going to be in there with a video camera, as she said, but you couldn't hear. All this is being done underground, often in military hospitals, and so on. Now, I cannot say with any certainty. I think we can say with certainty about the part from the executed prisoners that their families say that this has happened and they know they haven't been given. I don't think that's in doubt. The part about the taking living people in underground facilities, I cannot be proved. So yes, it's happened. On the one hand, but on the other hand, can the United States legitimately, even if you could prove it, could we do anything about it? No. I mean, it's the sad truth. I'm sorry, question?
We hear a lot about the conflicts between Taiwan and the mainland. Could you discuss any factors that might mitigate in favor of reunification?
I like to call it unification because Taiwan was never part of the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese, by the way, is the same. So in saying reunification, you're playing Beijing's, in other words, it's not a neutral statement, but the mitigating factors, the United States got very upset, well, put it this way, George W. Bush's administration got annoyed with the then president of Taiwan, Chen Shui-bian, because he seemed to be advocating independence, taking steps not toward a declaration of independence, but taking steps to consolidate the de facto independence of Taiwan. And George W. Bush actually got up there on the podium with Hu Jintao standing next to him, standing next to him, and he said that we object to the actions of the president of Taiwan. Well, the Taiwan people, next election, they elect somebody who says, I'm not going to do this, a man named Ma Ying-jeou. And Ma Ying-jeou has pursued a very accommodative position toward unification, and he keeps saying that this is just economics, it's not politics. Now, I know Ma Ying-jeou very well, and you can tell I'm not one of his admirers, okay? Paul said I was very forthright, and I'm being forthright here, and he's a phony, okay? And he is saying that it's just politics, it's not just economics, it's not politics. There is no way to separate economics and politics, none whatsoever. Not in the United States, doubtless not on Mars, and definitely not in Taiwan. And so now Beijing wants Taiwan. This is not a question at issue. So how does Beijing do this? It makes economic partnerships, and it puts Taiwan, which is 1/65th the size of China, in a position of dependency on the Chinese for its livelihood. And there's no way of squirming out of that. And Ma Ying-jeou is not stupid. He knows what he's doing. And so he's just, but I see this, and I know this isn't going to be very popular, but I'm not running for office for anything. And that is, I think the tipping point has been passed. In other words, I don't think there's any going back on this. And the only thing that would save Taiwan from being osmosed into the mainland at this point is if China should fall apart. And the chances of China falling apart are, what, 5 in 1,000? It's just not going to happen. So, again, I am pessimistic about the survival of Taiwan. And just to show you how popular I am with the current Chinese government, there is the current Taiwan government. I am an expert on the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. Okay, I've written articles on it and so on. The TECO, the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office in Miami, is giving a seminar on Taiwan's position on the islands. And they have invited my junior colleague in the history department, whose specialty is Qing Dynasty administrative arrangements, to give the lecture. And I've got better things to do next Saturday, so my ego isn't bruised by this, but I just think it's very amusing. Yeah. Dr. Sorry, who next?
It seems to me that the overwhelming goal of China's domestic policy is stability. And there are two forces that militate against stability. The income inequality problem and the special preferences that are given to people in the party. those two problems are mitigated, there's this underlying danger facing stability in China. You know, the beginning of this point is passed in China. The magic number 46 or 48 is there. And that makes one worry about short-term future stability in China. What can I don't know whether there's any external forces or external influences that can be brought to mitigate those two tensions. How do you address that?
Well, I think this is what Wen Jiabao, the outgoing premier, really tried to do. And as is always the case with people in high positions, there's people who think he's a great guy and he's doing a wonderful job, and then there are other people who thought he was a flower shop, meaning something that looks very pretty on the outside, but you know it's basically dirt and stuff like that behind it. But he, at least his public face was of somebody who really, really cared. And he went around and some woman came up and she said, my husband is a migrant worker and they've reneged on paying his wages. And Wen Jiabao arranged for the wages to be paid. And he also went around and he would actually shake hands with somebody with HIV/AIDS, and which nobody else would do. And so he really, really tried. And in his valedictory speech, he said, my work has fallen far below my expectations, which is kind of, you know, it's a really poignant moment kind of thing. So there are people trying to address these, but it's just such a huge problem. And when corruption becomes endemic in a society, and people keep saying it's getting worse, how do you go back? And I know Chinese say to me, you know, I know I have to offer bribes. I don't like doing this, but it's the only way for my business to get done. Everybody does it, and I have to do it too. And I don't see any way of really addressing it. And to me, there's a high degree of, I don't know, the system can muddle along. And if for a long, long time, certainly if you listen to Americans would complain incessantly about the things that bother us, and we have no thought that we're going to march on Washington and overturn it. But I think the difference is that in the United States, if you think the incumbent is a jerk, you have, in 4 more years at max, you have a chance to turn it around. And in China, you don't. And there's kind of 2 schools of thought on this one. One of them is a firebrand economist named He Qingwen. And she says that she compares China to this Chinese situation. She says it's like underground fires are burning. And occasionally they break through to the surface. And the Chinese, Beijing, sends fire trucks and they put out the fire. But she says, you put out the external manifestation, and meanwhile the fires are spreading. And one of these days, they're going to break through in so many places that the fire trucks can't handle them, and you're going to have the government overthrown. And the other view is something called resilient authoritarianism. And that means that even though the government remains authoritarian and has no plans to change that, it will bend and it will put band-aids on, and it will make small adjustments, and this will keep people happy. And my thoughts lean with the last one. Paul,
we have time for one
more. Ask the question.
We have somebody up here in the corner, so we'll do 2 more quick ones.
Okay.
I just want to comment first that there is a large conclave of Taiwanese moving to relinquish their knees in Shanghai. They actually...
All over, actually.
Yeah. And my question is the China's GDP actually accurate? Did they factor
Chinese economist, and a very good one named Hu Angan, who has tried to do this, and he says that the corruption is reducing the GDP by 25%, which is a lot. And there is no way, as far as I know, of measuring the effect of the pollution, but it's very serious. Everybody agrees with that. What happens? I don't know. I mean, like I say, the government is really trying to reduce the pollution. Shanghai is full of signs saying don't waste, but most people don't seem to be paying attention. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Yeah.
What, that person right up there, yes.
Oh, thank you. Mine's a quick question, I think, related to the Chinese immigrant workers. Is this associated with a government policy of exporting population? Do you know?
I do not think it is connected with a government policy of exporting the population. Some of them just don't. They can make more money abroad and they decide to stay there. But it's interesting because I was asked to speak to the Retired Air Force Association in Homestead, Florida, and it was one of these things, I just couldn't say no to the guy. And it turned out to be really interesting because there was a guy there, retired Air Force pilot, who owned a mine in South Africa. And he said that his fellow mine owner, who was Chinese, he told him that the Chinese government will supply these Chinese workers with a one-way ticket to South Africa. And the contract is for 5 years. So after 5 years, they can return, but at their own expense. And these are not wealthy people. So the supposition is that they're going to choose to stay on another 5-year contract, by which time they will probably have married a local lady and produced a couple of kids. So in that sense, that would fit with your scenario.
It's just like Reddit suggested that it is. That's
But nobody has ever, to my knowledge, has said we are exporting our population. Paul, do you want to take the next person?
That's it. I think that's our last question. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll come up later.